Hey everyone, this is Nehemias here. Welcome to this episode of the Piouspodium, where we talk everything about apologetics, difficult questions in theology, and all things philosophy. This is a part 2 continuation talk about epistemology and perspectives in epistemology. When we last spoke about epistemology, we spoke about theories of how we get knowledge, what truth is, and now we're going to start to shift the conversation of epistemology into a different direction. We're going to be speaking on different kinds of knowledges and the bridge of justification that moves us from knowledge towards truth. In philosophy, it's very common for us to call knowledge that is not justified to be just mere opinion, and that movement from opinion to knowledge that bridge is justification. So, as a quick overview, just in case some of y'all haven't heard the other episode that I'm referring to, we spoke about the different theories of getting knowledge known as objectivism and subjectivism. Although there is a third that's now known and is surging up called constructivism, objectivism and subjectivism are the most prominent theories of knowledge. And in objectivism, it basically says that there are truths that are in the world that we can objectively know, and that can be done so by two ways, either by holding on to an empiricist or rational type of theory. So rationalism and empiricism are what undergird that objectivist mode of thinking. And then the other would be subjectivism, saying that the world doesn't have, right, those clear objective truths to tell us, rather we impose them, right? So that in some sense are the different theories of getting knowledge that are really important to really kind of remember as we continue this conversation. Because what we're going to find out is there is this only one, again, perspective of knowledge that we're speaking about when we're speaking about objectivism or subjectivism. We're speaking of knowledge of truths. But as we get a little bit further down this conversation, we're going to talk about how that doesn't fully enclose or categorize all the kinds of knowledges that there are in this world. So before we get there, there's a few things that I want to continue reviewing, which are the different understandings of what truth is in its essence. We have the correspondence theory of truth, pragmatic theory of truth, and the coherence theory of truth. And I'm not going to get into great detail about the definition of all these theories of truth. However, what I want to point out here, and this is where we're going to get into the new points of conversation today, is that these theories of knowledge and these theories of truth are all only speaking about one kind of knowledge, which are the knowledge of truths. And there are other kinds of knowledge that I want to get into right now that I think are very practical, things that no person that lives in the world would ever deny because it's so obviously ingrained into our existence and the kinds of knowledges that we have. So there are three kinds of knowledge that I want to talk about here. There's the know-how. There's knowing by acquaintance and knowing a statement or truth. That last one, knowing a statement or a truth, is kind of the basis or the only kind of knowledge and truth that all these theories that we have spoken about really try to cover. But there's also something called know-how knowledge. An example of this is a skill like I know how to shoot a basketball. That isn't a truth or knowledge that is a knowing of something in some ways of a statement, right? This is something that I understand relationally and I know how to do it, right? In regular common day language, that's how we say it. And there's also knowing by acquaintance. An example of this is I know my brother, Benjamin. I know him. And this knowing him, we're going to get deeper into this, isn't really just talking about knowing statements or facts about him. There's something grander going on. There's something else that we are speaking about and invoking when we talk about that kind of knowing. And that last knowing is the knowing of a statement, claim, or truth, which is something, for example, like I went to school in Montclair. That's the college I went to in Montclair. So those are three different types of knowing. And these kinds of knowings are also perspectives in some way. So when we talk about knowing someone, like I said, this is a relational thing. For me to say that I know Benjamin, I'm speaking about a person and I'm speaking about something happening between both of us that allows for this kind of knowing to happen. And this is an existential kind of perspective. If we remember John Frame's definitions of the existential, the situational, and the normative, you're going to understand what I'm talking about here. This is an existential thing. This is a person-to-person thing. However, when we're talking about knowing things like facts, where I went to college, we're talking about something normative. We're talking about these meta statements, facts, and truth. This kind of knowledge or these kind of truths are cold, right? There is no life in them in some sense. But the last, right, is this skill, like I know how to shoot a basketball. And that is a relation to the world and knowing how to do something. And in some ways, I believe that this resembles the situational approach. It's representing being in the world and relating to the world, the things in this world, and knowing how to act in the world. So these perspectives are important for us to point out, because what we're seeing then is that secular philosophy has tried to isolate these kinds of knowledges through reductionism and have made the knowledge of truth claims or of facts and statements the only kind of truth, the highest kind of truth. And that is far from the truth. So let me try and explain what that means. Knowledge can't be isolated. Knowing me, existentially speaking, or knowing a person includes knowing facts about me, correct? But it is done so in a context of the world where there's a relation that is happening, possibly emotionally, but definitely relationally speaking. And so to know me existentially revolves around situational knowledge as well, because you have to know how to relate to me emotionally. That's a skill, that's a know-how, that's a situational skill or knowledge. And you have to have that knowledge to then even know me existentially speaking. And in the other perspective, or the other way around, vice versa, some of the facts that you might know about me, normatively speaking, that make up knowing me existentially, have come about from watching me possibly act in the world. There are normative facts, claims of knowledge and truths that we come to find out by watching somebody situationally, or from somebody else telling you situationally as well. And this kind of interaction between all these knowledges, or honestly the depth of knowledge and of actually really knowing something, is something that philosophers have come up and called tactic knowledge. This kind of ingraining, this kind of presupposing of all these knowledges, the way that they interact and mesh together, is called tactic knowledge. And tactic knowledge is kind of an implicit knowledge that is not fully expressed or verbalized. And this is something so important because I think it's very well shown in the know-how kinds of knowledge. If I was to try to teach somebody how to kick a soccer ball, I can't just verbatim tell you how to do it. It's not a knowledge that you get by knowing the claim, right? Which is possibly running up to the ball in a particular angle, wrapping your foot around the ball and following through correctly. That isn't me really teaching you how to do something in some ways. It's not really the instruction. That's not how you come to the knowledge of knowing how to kick a soccer ball. That kind of knowledge comes from feeling the ball. It's a feel to experience, right? That really transfers over that know-how knowledge to another person. And in the same way, when I know another person, right? When I say I know Benjamin, or somebody says, hey, I know you, there isn't really a number of facts that we can be like, okay, when you know X number of facts about a person, you know this person existentially. And so that's really interesting for us to see too, because we're talking about knowing another person, and we can also talk about getting to know that person more. And those are like really interesting epistemological claims we're saying. We're saying, I know someone, but I can get to know more. However, I thought to know something is to know something comprehensively, right? At least that's how secular philosophy has always seen it. And so knowing another person existentially, going back to my example, involves and entails much more than an objective number of facts for you to somehow know somebody. In Redeeming Philosophy, I love how Vern Poythress puts this. He says, tactic knowledge always lies in the background of even the simplest, most explicit, most self-consciously aware knowledge of a truth. It's something that happens in the background, and it's not something that we can really reduce to one kind of knowledge, like knowledge of statements or of truths. So there's a question that comes up in epistemology here, which is, well, how does knowledge become truth? Because as I was saying before, in philosophy, it's very popular for us to hold that if we have a belief in something, but it isn't truly justified, then it is just an opinion. But when we justify a knowledge or an opinion, it becomes a truth. So this is really key, and I think it's important. I want to really make a pause to speak here and unpack this, because it is very common in Christian thought for us to use the word faith as a kind of unjustified knowledge or a whimsical belief that isn't substantiated by any kind of evidence and is really just somehow a wishful thinking in some ways. And this is one of the key things that I think students have to get down. It's that faith and science, or faith and facts, faith and reasoning are not opposed to one another in some way, that they are not compatible in some sense. God created reason, God created science, He created that structured way of pursuing knowledge and truth. And that does not exclude the element of faith, or it doesn't exclude what faith is in its essence. What is that? What do I mean by that? Well, if we look at the Bible, we see that Hebrews 11 says, now faith is a substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things that are not seen. So faith isn't, right, the enemy of justification. That's entirely wrong. Faith, according to the Bible, is a justified belief that has an evidence about it. However, that evidence might not entirely be empirical to some degree. We might agree in that sense, right? But faith does have an evidence, even if that evidence is sometimes connected to the world of the unseen and the spiritual realm. And that's something that I always want to clear up to people, because I know that you can get really easily tricked and taught very quickly into your academic studies or moving into philosophy that faith and reasoning, or faith and justification, are opposed to one another. But if we look at what biblical faith actually is, we'll see that evidence and justification are just as much a part of it. So how do we, right, talk about justification in non-Christian philosophy, There are two questions that we ask when we talk about justification. First is the location of justification, and the second is the structure of knowledge, or the structure of that justification. And this is really important. So what are the three most popular location of justification theories? Well, we have internalism, externalism, and virtue epistemology. And I know there are a lot of terms that I'm throwing out at you guys in this episode and between last episode as well about epistemology. It's probably because truth, knowledge is one of the most important human endeavors. It's the highest intellectual and possibly even human endeavors that we could ever try and go on, right? It's to know, and to know with certitude and with and to know definitively. And so that's why I think in philosophy especially, right, there is this search for truth. There is this search for that definitive, right, knowing of something. So that's why all these questions come up and all these theories are really jumping out in the air inside of academia. So what are these location of justification theories? What do they mean in a general definition here? Well, internalism says that justification of knowledge happens within one's mind. Externalism, on the contrary, is going to say that justification happens external to the mind, meaning that it is dependent if the knowledge was found or caused appropriately. And virtue epistemology is where knowledge is justified. We have intellectual virtues. And by that, I'm gonna try and break that down a little bit more, comparing them again to the perspectives that we've been speaking about, the existential, situational, and normative. Internalism is an existential approach because we're saying that the justification of how I know an opinion is true and is actually a truth and not just an opinion is when I rely solely on my individual internal reasoning. It happens internally, in my own mind. That's what justifies if it's true, if I've justified it in my own mind. However, we know that that is far from the truth. Even if many people internally do that, that isn't necessarily the case. Why? Because especially in even truths about statements or facts, those statements are about something and they're about the world. And so the internal reasoning, right, isn't going to be enough. There is another kind of justification, which externalism talks about. It's situational, meaning that it is external, which is forming knowledges through processes outside of the mind and inside of the world. Remember, our knowledge is about the world in some sense. And so that cannot be justified internally to our mind. When we think about the correspondence theory of truth, we see that, right? We're talking about truth being truth only if it corresponds to what is outside, external to our minds, not just how we perceive things and reason them within our own conscience. And that last one, virtue epistemology, as the location of where our justification happens, is, again, talking about intellectual virtues. This is a normative approach, right? Because it is talking about how norms and high principles of intellectual virtues, if we follow these virtues in epistemology, and we follow them and we adhere to them, then we're going to produce a justified kinds of knowledge. And when we spoke about these kinds of virtues, we spoke about intellectual humility, intellectual courage, and those kinds of virtues. We're saying, at least the philosophy is saying here in virtue epistemology, that if we follow these intellectual virtues, we're going to have a justified kind of knowledge. And in some sense, like I said, these justifications of knowledge shouldn't just be one or another. We need all of them. In some sense, these are just perspectives that are necessary to get to the true knowledge that we want to receive. We need to have internal reasoning because we are the beings who know. We are the beings who are receiving the knowledge in some sense, or even creating the knowledge by interacting with the world. We need the external processes, like I said, because our knowledge is about the world and how to be in the world, especially when we're talking about truths about ethics and morality. And finally, we need virtues to guide us in that process for a heart and a mind posture, if I could speak in that language, to get to truth. There is no trying to reason or even try and empirically verify something and justify something externally or internally. If we don't have intellectual humility and intellectual honesty, for example, we will distort, right? And allow for maybe our own biases or prejudices to get in the way of truth. And this is especially true, I think, right, in both sides of the academic discussion that goes along between Christians and non-Christians, where prejudices and biases, in some ways, fundamentally, they cannot be removed, but they can at least be pointed out and avoided in some way. And I think that's really important for us to understand here. Intellectual virtues, in some way, allow us to not skew too far into the extremes of our bias. Although when we speak about bias, we're speaking about presuppositions and we're speaking about particular presuppositions that we hold, that at least if we're honest about them, right, we're going to be able to get very far in communicating and having effectivity, right, in our pursuit of knowledge and truth. So that's location of justification for us in internalism, externalism, and virtue epistemology. But this leads us to our last question here, right? Because you might be asking yourself, well, how do I know when to stop asking for more justification? That's obviously what many philosophers before us have asked, right? It's like, well, I can justify a knowledge by going to this justification, but then how do I justify that justification and that justification and that justification? Well, here comes the structure, right, of our knowledge or our justification in these three more philosophies. And guys, I say this in every single episode. These are not definitive definitions of these philosophies. These are just basic overviews, right? But that does not mean that the way that we are interacting with them right here in this podcast, in this talk, doesn't apply. You're going to have to do some extra thing. And these are tools for us to use when we're being bombarded with different philosophies that are trying to say that our belief in God or our belief in the Bible and the message of the Bible are unjustified and that they are just faith. As I spoke before, faith is not diametrically opposed to justification or evidence. That is far from the truth of the Bible, and it's far from the truth of what the book of Hebrews, as I referenced before, is telling us. Moving on though, what's the structure of justification? How much farther down can we keep going? Or is there even a foundation for us to keep going to in our justification? Well, in the structure of justification, we have three different types of theories. The first is foundationalism, and the second is coherentism, the third one being contextualism. So in foundationalism, we are saying that there are foundational beliefs that no longer need to be explained. What are some examples of this? Some examples of a foundationalist approach to justification or the structure of justification is that maybe a theory of logic is a kind of knowledge or a kind of justification that can't be broken down any further. Let me put another example here. I'm using words that we've already used in our discussion of epistemology. Empiricism, right? When we hold to empiricism, we're saying that there is no knowing or justification or foundation of knowing that is beneath or is more deeper than knowing through the senses, because empiricism is to know things through the senses. And we might say in foundationalism, right, that empiricism is the most basic kind of knowledge. So if we apply this to an ethical truth that we want to pursue and justify, we might make a truth claim and say that the way we know that stealing is wrong, for example, is based on the empirical data of people saying they are happy in a town, or because we have observed, right, empirically speaking, that it is good and it is right for us not to steal, or in consequence, it is wrong for us to steal. In this sense, right, empiricism is the foundational justification. And obviously, if we held another foundational level of justification, we could move deeper than just empiricism for our justification. This is just a mere example of foundationalism in play. However, in coherentism, we're talking about something else. And basically, coherentism is saying there is no foundational belief about getting or gathering knowledge and justifying knowledge. Rather, beliefs are justified when they cohere with other truths. None are more foundational than the other. So imagine that there are just many meta-truths or meta-justification avenues, and none are more deeper than the other. They work together, and as long as your information in this avenue cohere, then you have something that is justified and true. So, an example. Stealing is wrong because it coheres with other moral truths that seem to reflect respecting others and their properties, and that's basically something that you found possibly through societal data and empirical data, right? And so in some ways, we could see that maybe an empirical view and a rationality of getting norms, these are both foundational. And so in philosophy, we wouldn't say, well, in foundationalism, there are two foundations, because that doesn't make sense. A foundation has to be singular. So we call it coherentism, where there are multiple foundational views, right? That when they cohere with one another, we find a truth. And the final is contextualism, is that we seek justification only in particular contexts. And this is something that's super popular in the philosophy of science, whereby one theory, when we try to test it, we suspend it in the air, but we don't question the other theories that allow us to even study this theory. Let me try and explain that, because I know I just said the word theory about 5 times in a row. An example would be when we want to test something like gravity. If we wanted to test something about gravity, we have to assume other theories about the reality of time and motion. We have to also assume about the speed of light being what it is, so that we can even calculate the movement of something by the force of gravity, correct? So contextualism is saying you can't keep asking about foundational things. You can't even ask about, these multiple contextualism types of foundational beliefs. They're just saying, well, in reality, all that is true is going to be when we test one thing, we're suspending and we're assuming the other one. So there isn't really like a way that we should even be asking those questions about foundational structures of knowledge. So to put that again into the example that we were using in ethics, when we test a moral truth, we only test it in the context of the others or other moral truths being presupposedly true. So theft or murder being wrong, when we test that theory, whether it's empirically, whether it's rationally, it doesn't matter. It's that we're testing it against the backdrop of the other moral truths already being true. We can't truthfully isolate one or the other. And so there is no foundational, right? It's just all these theories kind of just being presupposed while we test the other. And I know that these are really deep conversations, but hopefully I just want to point out a few things that the Christian can take away from all these theories that we just spoke about as we close the episode in the coming minutes. The Christian can see a few things. One is that the foundational reality of truth is not in man's reason or in the world, right? So this obviously is denying the ultimacy of internalism or externalism, because in both of those you're replacing God. God is the foundation and mediator of these knowledges like know-how knowledges, acquaintances, or knowing of facts, right? So in some ways, when we see foundationalism is an empiricism, and it isn't even rationalism in some sense, because those are justified by God himself. And so in the mediation from God of knowledge and of truth, we see some truth in coherentism as well. What is the truth of coherentism? If we remember coherentism well, what we're going to remember or realize here is that we need interaction with the world and others to fully grasp the tactic knowledge involved in acquaintances, know-how, and knowing of facts. And all of these happen as a result of God's presence and control inside of the world. And finally, we see the common grace in contextualism, because it's talking about the limitations of our knowledges, because we can only really search for knowledge in particular context. When we inspect an idea or theory, as I was mentioned before, we are doing so in the context of other theories or ideas that we assume. And if we look at it through a Christian perspective, we can recognize the limitation of the human, but we can also still ask the foundational questions that we need to ask, because we understand that God is at the foundation. Even in our limitation, we understand that he is not limited in those ways that we are. So the Christian, like I said, sees foundationalism, can see coherentism and contextualism, and see the common grace and combine them into a view that puts God at the center, the mediator of knowledge, of truth, and that we can trust our senses and we can trust our reasoning in some sense when we follow the intellectual virtues that God has placed for us inside of his word. And when we do all these things, we have a justified knowledge that epistemology is looking for. But it's not found in any of these theories reductionistly or reductionally. We find it in the perspective and the nature of God himself in these perspectives. So basically, that ends our introduction of epistemology. And what an introduction it was. It had to take 2 episodes for me to get through all the information that really epistemology has. And my prayer is that it's been helpful to you. For the Christian, when we want to justify our knowledge, we should use these perspectives as starting points. And when we attack, on the contrary, false philosophies, we must remember how perspectives point out the sin of reductionism and the majesty of God's nature and intellectual activity. So we have to be on guard, really ready to defend our faith, because what the world and what different systems of belief try to do is try to undermine our confidence in that which we know to be true. And the last thing we want is to be, as the word says, to have tasted of the great gift of the Holy Spirit, to have tasted the word of truth, to know it in that way that we have known it, and to then fall away because we allowed the enemy to seep in and bring doubt to the justified knowledge we had. This is the exact same thing he did to Eve in the garden, and it hasn't changed ever since. So I'm praying in the name of Jesus that you might be able to be justified in your knowledge, knowing for sure that what God said and what God shows is true and it's justified. My name is Nehemias. If you're watching me and you're watching the Piouspodium on YouTube, I just hope that you would subscribe, like, and share it with someone else. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can follow, and you can also continue to share as we release episodes every single Monday. I'm Nehemias Jimenez. Thank you for being here, and I hope to see you next time.